Aloha and welcome to our third video explaining Meteor application template React. First video was just kind of an overview from the user perspective. Second video was startup and data initialization. This video is going to go through and look at the pages and how they're laid out and get a little bit into React hooks and so forth. So let's start by bringing up the system. Sorry, I'll go a little faster. So we'll say Meteor npm run start. And while that's starting up, I want to recommend that if you want to get the most out of these videos, you should be actually typing the things that I'm typing as I type them, going to the pages that I'm going to in your own editor while I'm going to them, playing around with things. Okay, there's something to be said for watching this on the bus while you're going home. That's a passive thing, but you're unlikely to learn as much from that. So if you've got some dead time, you're not doing anything else, sure, watch the video, but you may need to go through it again later on in a more active fashion in order to kind of really understand, what's happening here and verify it for yourself. So if we take that and we, type it in here or just simply hit refresh, we get this landing page. And let's sign in, just to kind of go through, remind everybody of the basic workflow. We can log in and then we get an add stuff page, a list stuff page, an admin page, and of course we have these sign in and sign out pages, okay, as well as the landing page, right? So let's figure out how these pages are displayed. Okay, so to do that, in the last video, as you recall, I talked about the fact that there were two distinguished directories, server directory and a client directory. And in the last video, I said, well, listen, when you start up the server, which is what's going on right here, okay, the way that Meteor actually does that is to go into the server directory, find the main.js, load these files. And loading those files results in the server coming up. When we visit the site, that server, by typing in localhost 3000 in a browser, we are a client making a connection. So in that case, Meteor knows to go into this distinguished directory called client and execute the main.js file, okay? As well as, I guess, the main.html file. All right, so what happens here is just as before. We're going to, each time a browser connects and tries to load the URL from localhost 3000, or once you've deployed it, the actual site on the internet, you're going to start up by loading this file, which is an imports startup client startup.jsx. Okay, and when we load this file, we're going to invoke or we're going to add a function to a passive function as the value of this special function called startup, which basically tells Meteor that when, once a client is connected and Meteor has finished doing all its internal kind of stuff, it will invoke this function, which is what we supply, to say, okay, here's what we actually want. Here's the entry point to the user interface to our application. And what that does, and this is kind of the standard React style stuff, is that we call React create root. We find a document, or we find an element with this ID, and then we're going to render the app React component at that spot. Okay, so just to see where that is, if we go into main.html, you can see here is a div who's got the ID root, and we add some classes here just to make things look a little better, and we're off. Okay, and you'll probably want to edit that title string in your application and so forth. So we're going to load this startup file. And then just for completeness, right, we need to load all of the bootstrap files, which is we do here. And then we load the style.css. And this is where you can put all sorts of code to override defaults and add certain things. So your documents, application specific styling can go here. It can go other places as well, but your more global stuff you can put in this directory. All right, so we've got this startup.jsx. It's going to render the app component. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, to understand that, we say, oh, look, we got to go into this UI directory. And then there's going to be a layouts, and then it's in there. So let's go look in the UI directory. So now we're outside of the startup spot, but we're in this UI, okay? And you can see that there's basically, in this imports directory, which is where most of the code is, we have an API directory. That's going to turn out to be kind of the data model for the application, all right? And data is interesting because it exists both on the client side and on the server side, right? If it was only on the server side, then clients wouldn't see any data. If it was only on the client side, then there'd be no such thing as shared data, right? So you need to think about data as being this entity that exists on the server side and exists on the client side. And that kind of relationship between those two places, different clients maybe see different kinds of data, obviously, is what makes applications interesting. Anyway, so that's the API directory. It kind of transcends both the client and server side. Startup is the stuff that happens to get stuff going. And then UI is all the stuff for the user interface, what we see on the client side. And by convention, we have this kind of best practice where we're going to decompose our UI directory into 3 other directories: components, layouts, and pages. Okay, and this is because we're going to organize our UI with these 3 conceptual ideas. One is a layout. So is there a structure to the overall screen that's going to be displayed to the user? And the classic one, which is implemented here and implemented, 90% of all websites. I don't know if it's 90%, it could be 60%, but, whole lot of them. I would probably say the majority. The majority have a nav bar at the top. They have something at the top, which is generally, constant across the entire site. They have something at the bottom, a footer, which generally tends to be constant across, the entire site. And then between the header and the footer, or the nav bar and the footer, is stuff that's different for every single page or every single URL. Let's put it that way. So if you're at a site, no matter what URL you have, you'll probably have something that looks relatively the same at the top, something that looks relatively the same at the bottom, and then in between those, who knows what, right? So layout is and you'll see in here we have a single layout, which turns out to be that app.jsx, right here, okay? So that's what's creating this, going to implement this overall structure, this overall paradigm of a header, footer, and stuff in between. And the stuff in between we're going to call, in this approach, a page. So we're going to define all of the different things that could occur in between the header and the footer as different pages. All right? And then finally, inside a page, you have kind of little widgets, little sections, and more or less often, you might have a little widget or a little section that appears on more than one page. So in order to kind of modularize, in order to prevent these page files from becoming immense, we want to kind of modularize them a little bit, and also that can create opportunities for sharing. And so we call the components of a page a component. All right, so that's our 3 directories: layouts, pages, okay, all the stuff that goes in the middle, and then components are the little pieces that, are sections of a page. And it turns out that our nav bar and our footer, we're going to call, put in the component directory, because they're not a layout, obviously, and they're not even a page. They're something smaller than that. So this basic layout is going to scale pretty well. Eventually you probably will have directories underneath components. You might have multiple layouts. You might have subdirectories under pages. Like a popular one is given the role. You might have under pages like an admin directory, and then all the pages for the admin goes there, and then under the pages directory you could have another user, or whatever, client or customer or something, and all the pages for the customer goes underneath there. So you can make, generally this top level is going to work pretty well, although you may want to create more hierarchy underneath as your system gets more complicated. All right, so let's look at app.jsx. Okay, and what's interesting about this is you can see what app does. We're going to use React Router to implement this paradigm, this design pattern. We'll talk about design patterns later, but note the use of the term design pattern. Okay, here's an example of a design pattern. This idea that for every, given we're using this, our top level React component is app, every single page is going to display this navbar React component at the top. Every single page is going to display this footer component at the bottom. And then what goes in between? Well, we use React Router to say what goes between, what's actually going to be rendered between the navbar and the footer depends upon the URL that the user types. So if the user typed just localhost 3000 in this case, then we're going to display landing. If they type in or otherwise click, a URL that goes to localhost 3000/signin, they'll go to sign in, and so forth. So that's how we actually display things. And then the other thing you'll notice is that we have this idea of protected routes and admin protected routes. And the idea there is, and this is, kind of, more or less boilerplate code, but the concept is we want to make sure that certain pages are not displayed unless the user's logged in and an admin, in the case of an admin protected route. Okay? In the case of just a protected route, we want to make sure that the user is logged in, and if they're not logged in, we just want to send them straight to the sign-in page. Okay? So that's how we, and then in other pages like the landing page, you don't have to be an admin, you don't have to even be logged in. You can see that from anywhere, and the sign-in, sign-up page similarly. Okay, so that's a super simple overview of the routing. It can get more complicated. We'll talk maybe later about this, where we're specifying a path where one of the components of the path is actually, could be anything, and is going to be bound to this variable called _ID, which enables us to use a value from the URL when we actually display the page, which is a pretty cool thing. So that's how we build this idea of the layout of the application. Okay, so when we go to localhost 3000, what we'll see is we see the landing page. So I use landing page in this class. I say landing page when I mean the page that anybody can get to. It's the top level page of your site. I call the home page the page that you get to when you're a user and you log in. The first page that you see as your home, your personal home. So I distinguish landing and home, and it's kind of, a lot of people would call this the home page, but that gets tricky because when you log in as a user, then you see another page. What are you going to call that? The personal page or something? So I use landing and home just to distinguish the two. You might use different terminology. Doesn't really matter, but just so you understand what I mean. When I say landing, I mean that top level page, and I call it landing. So let's look at that page. Why shouldn't we? Why not? Okay. So the landing page is a pure React function. So there's in React, you can the kind of the original way we thought of things, the way they implemented initially was using classes. Then they've moved to this idea of using pure functions, and so that's what we're teaching in this class, and it's a very elegant way of doing it. So we're defining a variable called landing, which is equal to a function of no arguments that is going to return this value. This value is JSX, okay, which is a way that React allows you to write what kind of turns out to look like HTML in a way, but within JavaScript, and have everything work out. And so what we're going to return from this function, this landing function, pure function, is a bootstrap container, And with some Bootstrap stuff in there. We're gonna have a rounded circle image. We have two columns. We use some Bootstrap magic to get things to look good. All this is just, this is just basically pure Bootstrap with a tiny bit of React wrapping and then a tiny bit of Meteor wrapping around that. Okay, no big deal. Now let's go, however, once we log in, so just so that we're all on the same page, once we log in, the nav bars change. We're still on that landing page inside. So let's go to list stuff, okay, and see how that works. And this is where, things do start to get interesting. So we go to list stuff, okay. We're gonna, let's just make it clear. So here's the list. The URL contains list, and then that means we go through our layout component and we see list. And so we make sure that the user's logged in, and then we display this list stuff page. So that's how we actually got here. Okay. So what we find is that list stuff is a pure React function, which means it's a function. It has no arguments, and we have a curly brace, which means that the body is a block. The body defines two variables called stuffs and ready, and then it returns something based upon the value of ready. If ready is truthy, okay, then it's gonna return a container. If ready is not truthy, if it's falsy, these are all, ridiculously enough, in JavaScript, truthy and falsy are technical terms, okay? They have defined meanings. Hopefully you're already familiar with that, but just to remind you, okay? So if it's truthy, we are going to return this container and display a list of things. If it's not truthy, we're going to display a loading spinner, okay? So the basic idea here is that for a page which is going to need to communicate with the server, which is going to take some time, all right? And we don't know how long it's going to take. If the server's burdened, it might take several seconds for the server to get around to servicing that reply. Or if the request involves a huge amount of data, it might take some time for the data to actually be retrieved and packaged up and sent back. On the other hand, if it's not very much time or not very much stuff that needs to be done, it could essentially happen in a blink of an eye. Okay, so anything could happen here when we're trying to display a page that involves some interaction with the backend database that could take some indeterminate amount of time. And so what I want you to first understand is the idea here is that there is this variable called ready, okay? And if that ready is true, then we display the page with all the data on it. If that variable is not true, we're going to display a spinner. Okay, so everybody knows the spinner, right? You see the page and there's something, a little beach ball or whatever that is cycling to tell you, hey, don't worry, I'm alive, kind of, but I'm not ready to give you the answer. And then it hopefully disappears in a second or 2 seconds or 3 seconds, and then the page displays. All right, so that's the overall idea of this page, is we're going to return either a spinner or the actual contents of the page based upon ready. Okay. Now the crazy thing is, well, all right, yeah, sure, that makes sense, except how the heck does that actually happen? Because after all, this is a pure function. It takes no arguments. I don't get it. Okay, and so what React does, I'm trying to figure out how much detail to go into here, but so let's try to keep it kind of high level, right? So when you're using this style of React, which is this kind of pure function approach where we define a function, okay, the recommended approach, which is super cool, I really like it, is to use this thing called React hooks. All right, and there should be a reading that you can read about React hooks, because it's a conceptual computational idea that is novel, and you have to read about it to kind of understand it, I think. I'll briefly explain it here. But there is more resources you can use if my explanation right now isn't good enough for you. So the idea here is we're going to define a React hook, okay? And this React hook is going to provide us with two variables, one called ready and one called stuffs. And the ready variable is, as you can see, that's going to tell us if it's truthy. It's going to say that the stuffs variable now has the contents of the database that we need in order to display the page. If ready is false, not true, then our stuffs variable does not yet contain what we need. Okay. So that's the thing I will say. All right. The other most important thing to know is that what's going to happen is list stuff is going to start rendering. Okay, and it's going to get a value for ready. All right, and it's going to do whatever it's going to see what ready is, and it's going to execute this. Okay, so you're going to get something basically right away, either the loading spinner or the container. But then, almost as if by magic, what's going to happen is if something changes inside here that alters the values that are returned, and thus the values of these two variables. You can almost think of this little use tracker thing as being run. I mean, it's not an infinite loop. It does stop. It's designed to be low overhead. But the idea is that this is kind of in the background, going to keep running. And whenever it runs and it turns out that stuffs and ready changes as a result, React knows, oh, I need to rerun this function and re-display the page because one of these two values has just changed. Okay, so that's the cool thing. And with hooks, that's all you kind of have to, well, that's not all you have to understand, but for right now, if you understand the notion that with hook functions, there will be things that happen in the world that are going to change these, one or two of these values, and whenever these values change, then I'm going to re-render the page. Okay, and so that's the magic of how we can have a pure function that doesn't seem to have any side effects yet is going to redisplay the page when things change, and that opens up lots of cool things. Like in Meteor, it's very trivial to have a chat application where you type one thing, everybody sees it as soon as you hit return, and this kind of hook function stuff is part of the magic for making pages update themselves without you having to hit refresh. Okay, so we need to have this this ready function define whether or not the data has been retrieved, and we want this stuffs variable to provide the information that we're going to display in the page if we start running this code here with this container thing in it. Okay, how we do that is we're going to use a Meteor method, or a Meteor function, called useTracker. And that is a function that takes a function as its argument, okay? And what that function is that is the argument is going to do the following. We're going to subscribe to a particular publication, okay? And publications are named as strings, and stuffs.user publication name means we have to go into, let's see, API stuff, okay? So we go in here, we can see this .user publication name is the name of this collection .publication.user. So we have this string that defines the user publication, and in startup server publications, here's where we actually define the publication. Stuffs.user publication name, okay, is a function that checks what this user ID is and returns all of the items in the stuffs collection owned by this user. Okay, so Meteor, there's more information about this that you probably will need to read, but the idea is this is a pub sub or publication subscription mechanism for data transfer. You define publications which specify how the server provides information, and then clients can subscribe to one or more publications to say, this is the kind of data that I want to receive from the server. All right, so going back to list stuff, we are going to subscribe to the stuff's user publication, which means that we're saying what we want to get is all of the stuff items owned by the user who is logged in right now. Okay? And so we define that subscription, and then we have this variable called ready, or RDY, which is bound to the value of calling this ready function, which is Meteor's way of telling you on the client, has the server actually completed sending over all the data, okay? Because there's no way, and the beauty of this is that under the covers, this, if ready returns false, the subscription mechanism, the pub sub mechanism, is going to take care of ensuring, well, the pub sub mechanism in combination with this tracker mechanism is going to make sure that this code is rerun periodically until this subscription completes, the data has been transferred successfully, at which point ready will stop returning false and return true, at which point stuff items is going to actually contain all of the total, all of the items associated with this user, not some subset because we haven't finished, but all of them. And then what's returned from this function is all of the items associated with this user, because the subscription is completed successfully. Ready will be true because now, since all the items have been transferred, the subscription.ready function will return true, which means that, if it was a lot of data, maybe the first couple of times this const statement was encountered, ready was returning false, so we were returning the bouncing pointer, the spinner. But eventually, we'll run this code, the subscription will complete, ready will become true, stuff items will have all the items that we need, and so stuffs and ready are bound to true and the actual amount of stuffs, which means our container displays. Okay, now because this is a very simple app, we can type refresh, and I mean, maybe I can see this spinning. I don't know that I can. I can see some crazy little thing happening for a second, but I don't even know, because it's just so fast. But you understand this, the basic idea, and it's kind of important actually, because if you don't have this ready thing in here, and then we just return this stuff, and it's in some partial state, I mean, you could get all sorts of weird things occurring, right? So you really want to guarantee that all of the data that you want to have from the database is actually present before you go ahead and try to render it, right? That just makes sense. Okay, there you go. Now you understand React hooks, how we're using them to get data out of the database, how we're using the ready method to make sure that we've got all the data before we display it. Now finally we go in and display it, and we're back in the land, the simple land, okay, of Bootstrap, and we're going to make a container, and it's going to have a row, and inside the row there'll be a column, and we'll have these quantities. And then the only thing that's kind of somewhat interesting is to get each row, we're going to map through all of our stuff items, our stuff objects. We're going to pass it in to this React component called stuff item. We pass a key, and that's so that each of these stuff items, because there's a map, there's going to be a bunch of these things, an array of them return. They each need to have this key field, which is unique, and so we use the ID field. You get a React warning if you forget about the key field, which you might. And there's another way to do this. Another really common approach is to say, like, you can the map function can have a second argument, which is the index of the element, and then you could say key equals index. We do that a lot in code when we don't have any other obvious way to have a unique index. It's not, You know, there are some folks that say, oh, you shouldn't do that. I've never had a problem with it, but at any rate, this is kind of the bulletproof way, is to say, okay, well, each item has a unique ID associated with it, so I'll make that the key. And then if we go into stuff item, what we can see is stuff item is going to return, you know, a row. Okay, so pretty easy. And then, you know, we have prop types. This is just standard React stuff that hopefully you've already covered. So that's list stuff. Okay, once you understand that, all right, this list stuff admin, pretty much the same, except now we're doing, you know, the admin publication. And we have another row called owner, so that's not a big deal. Let's get to add stuff. This gets into forms. I'm going to have a whole screencast just on forms, so I will defer this, but you can see, you know, we're going to return this container. Here we're not accessing anything from the database initially, so we don't have to have a use tracker thing. Instead, we're going to display this form, and then the issue is once somebody hits return or, you know, submit on the form, how do we actually communicate with the database? So I'll get into that later. Edit stuff. This also is form, so I'll do that later, but that involves displaying a form and it's pre-filled with data. So there we actually do need a subscription to retrieve the data that we want to display from the database, make sure it's ready, you know, the whole same thing as before, right? Except, you know, the return value is now not a whole array of things, it's a single document. And once we have that, we can go ahead and display it in the field. Yeah, and then sign in, you know, here we see, so this is an interesting one because if you read the documentation on React hooks, you'll see examples that look much more like this, where the method, they have a use state hook function which is pre-supplied by React, and it returns a value and then a function that can set that value that you use in your code. And so whenever you call the set function, it's going to change this value, which means the code is going to be rerun, or the page is going to be redisplayed. Sign out, I don't know. Yeah, pretty simple. Sign up, same kind of thing as before, you know, where we have a form and then we do something on submit. So there you go, I believe. Oh, so let's see what else we have here. Just for completeness, we have a footer. Simple. We have the loading spinner. Simple. We're just using the whatever spinner, the React Bootstrap spinner. We have the nav bar. I think that's just a bunch of, you know, Bootstrap. And, you know, we do need to use tracker to find out who the current user is, so that we, you know, can put the, you know, if there's a current user, then we're going to do something different. If it's the admin user, we're going to do something different. If they're logged in, we're going to do something different, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's our stuff item. I showed you that before, and stuff item admin is just the same as stuff item, except there's an owner. There you go. Now you understand how all the pages are implemented in the system, and you understand how when someone types in a URL, you go to a different page, and you understand, hopefully, when you go to a page that requires data from the database, like how that happens. It's amazing, right? But not too bad, I think. All right. See you later. Bye.